politicians, I've always liked the phrase political animal because I think that's a fairly descriptive of the way many of the battles are fought, certainly more so today maybe than 20 years ago. But in fact, if we read on a little bit in Aristotle, we'll see he says man is more of a political animal than bees or any other gregarious animals, and this is evident. So he actually is comparing humans to animals. He is thinking about humans as animals, and he's arguing that we are, to the extent he understood genetics, that we're born that way. We're born to be political. And I think that's obviously 2,000 years, odd years ago, that's a provocative thing to say. It remains provocative today. There are lots of concerns about what's nature, what's nurture. We usually think about it in areas like things like alcoholism or behavioral disorders. But the particular behavioral disorder I want to talk about is politics, which is, shares many of the characteristics, paranoia, delusions of grandeur, other things we normally associate with schizophrenia, are all apparent in people who are very active in politics and care a lot about these things. So what do we mean when we say that an animal has a special characteristic by nature? Well, the best way to do that is to study animals. And so what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to show you a brief study in which I studied humans, but studied them as if they were animals. And so, rather than talking to them the way we would in a survey, I just basically approached them as you would approach a group of animals. So I needed some political animals, and I wanted them to vary a little bit in their political orientation. So I made an expedition to Austin. And there's a lot of political animals in Austin, it being the state capital, and they vary substantially. As you know, Austin is both the seat of our deeply conservative Republican state government. Statewide offices are all Republican for as long as most of us can remember, and at the same time is the sort of hallowed ground of the remaining wild liberals that can still be found in the wild in the areas of Austin. As Garrison Keillor said when he did his show from Austin, it's not Texas, but you can see it from here. And so I encounter two groups there that are quite useful. This over here on I guess what's my left, you'll see what is actually a bill signing in Rick Perry's office. He's surrounded by a group of individuals, all of whom, in terms of just animal behavior, I believe are conservatives. And then on the other side, you'll see this a little political discussion that broke out somewhere near Zilker Park, and you'll see there are individuals that are, I believe, are not in fact political conservatives, but are actually political liberals. So I get my notebook out and I start taking down some notes. So the first thing I notice about the conservatives is they have very robust features and short hair, and the liberals have kind of more gracile features, both male and female. And they have longer hair, typically parted in the middle. So if you've ever read field notes from, people who study animals, these are just the kind of things that they're noting down. And so I'm just kind of taking these as they come along. After some discussion, observation, I note that physical violence is fairly common among the conservatives, and males dominate. There actually is a female in that picture. It's a little difficult to tell because she's wearing the same dark suit as the males. And of course, there's, I think, only one. There are lots of females, but again, here it's also a little bit difficult because some of the people's hair is long enough it's a little difficult to tell which. Anyway, among liberals, physical violence almost never occurs, and females dominate. So conservatives are largely patriarchal, and liberals are largely matriarchal. Conservatives are basically, kind of coarse and hot-tempered, and liberals are sensitive and attentive. You shouldn't take any of these to be pejorative because they're exactly the things that the opposite groups would say about the others, and that someone would take some pride in. So, they're sort of being quick-tempered and direct is something that my dad, who was a great conservative, would love to be described that way. It would not be a good idea to describe him as sensitive and attentive. That would likely move you back up one level there to physical violence is common and males dominate. So, and then we get to the sex. Anytime you study animals, you get to study sex. When you study people, we kind of shy away from this. But if we're going to go as far as to talk about, if we're going to talk about politics in polite society, we may as well talk about sex, which, by the way, is a pointer for those of you. I just survived a family Thanksgiving in which someone brought up politics, and it was a near disaster, right? I mean, tempers flared very quickly. It was a Canadian friend who had been invited to the dinner, and they had no idea really much about American politics. So they thought it would be a good idea halfway through the dinner to ask people to go around the table and say who they were going to support, in the next presidential election. I knew right away, if it got all the way around the table, we were going to have trouble. So I immediately changed the subject to sex. It's the only subject that can actually move people away from politics once they get at it. So conservatives, they copulate as necessary for reproduction. They're kind of proud of this, and using basically one position, and that's pretty much the party line there. Liberals, copulation is frequent. It's indiscriminate, same sex, opposite sex, themselves, every imaginable position. There just really is. You could fill notebooks, as the anthropologists do, with this sort of thing. And then one of the other things I noticed about conservatives is that when they're angry, they tend to, their hair stands up and they pull attackers close to them and bite them, whereas liberals seldom raise their hair and mostly defend themselves by a kind of vaguely ineffective kicking of the other person. Now, if you're paying attention to this, by the time you get to that last point, you may be beginning to wonder what the heck this is about, because this is a pretty strange observation, and in fact, they're all really kind of strange observations, because they're in fact not about liberals and conservatives at all. They are about chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees and bonobos are primates. They're very closely related. They live in approximately the same region of Africa, one on one side of a river, the other on the other side of the river. They don't interbreed. The populations haven't interbred for approximately 200,000 years. So they share a common ancestor, presumably. Bonobos were thought to be chimps until the late 1950s, with the first time that it was discovered that bonobos were a separate species. So they are a different species. Bonobos look like an immature chimpanzee. Most of the famous chimpanzees from the zoos, the German zoos, had a famous set of chimpanzees, all of which turned out to be bonobos. So that most of what were brought back from Africa as chimps and placed in zoos were in fact not chimps at all, but were bonobos. And if you run down that list, you'll see that I've stolen from those lists everything I said about liberals and conservatives. Chimpanzees are in fact coarse, hot-tempered. They raise their hair in anger. Physical violence is common, including collective violence against other chimpanzee troops. So they will go out in raiding parties and attack neighboring chimp groups and kill them. If they encounter a group that's larger than them, they'll very quietly retreat, so they're very strategic about this. Bonobos don't do any of that sort of thing. Chimps are a little less vocal. They do, in fact, copulate for reproduction only, and only one position. It happens not to be the missionary position because they are chimps, after all. And they do have robust features, prominent snouts, and very short hair. So you can see that chimp there looks like a, kind of a wise sort of elder conservative. The bonobos, on the other hand, are very sensitive. They're attentive. They're nervous. They rarely encounter physical violence. Their society is completely matriarchal. So your status as a bonobo is entirely a function of who your mother is. Your status as a chimp is entirely a function of who your father is. Your mother makes no difference in chimpanzee society. Your father makes no difference in bonobo society. So the dominant bonobo is a female. She's the matriarch. Everything descends from her. They're sort of do defend themselves basically by kicking, which they don't do particularly well. And they are famous for their sexual activity. They engage in sexual activity all the time that they're awake, with absolutely no regard to whether the fellow bonobo is a male or a female or anything else. They have sex in every possible position. They're the only primates that have missionary position sex. And not because they have some belief that it's religiously appropriate or anything else, but just because they have sex in every conceivable position, and therefore we get to that one eventually just by their level of, in a sense.
Dr. Alford,
yes.
Can I say something at this point? I'm glad to know now what y'all do over at Rice University.
Our motto is unconventional wisdom, and so we try to keep it as unconventional as possible. So you're absolutely right. You couldn't do this. I got my degree at University of Houston, and I couldn't have gotten away with this. I couldn't have gotten away with this at U of H. That's why I'm over. That's why I'm over at Rice with the other bonobos. So what I think is interesting about this is that if you ask me to characterize the politics of these two groups, there's a very famous book called Chimpanzee Politics by a fellow who studies chimpanzees, and there's an entire book about the political order of chimpanzees. They do have political life. They have selection for leadership. They engage in warfare. But there's a lot of the things we think of as human politics we also see in chimpanzees. But interestingly, if we take that same look at bonobos, we also see politics, but it doesn't look at all like chimpanzee politics. in that contrast, if I ask students, tell me once we read a little bit about chimpanzees and bonobos, who are the liberals and who are conservatives? Everybody agrees. Everybody scores it the same way. Chimpanzees are basically conservatives. Bonobos are basically liberals. And yet, there's no culture here. This is purely genetic transmission. This is just, they're born that way. Bonobos are born predisposed to a different social order, a different way of doing social life than the way chimpanzees are. And the two things don't mix, by the way. Chimpanzees and bonobos in the same enclosure are real problems, because the bonobo way of dealing with strangers is to reduce social tension by basically groping the other person. So this is so if you look at humans shake hands as a way of showing they mean no harm. Well, I'll leave it to your imagination what bonobos shake, but it's not your hand. And I'll tell you, this is not a good idea if you're dealing with conservatives. So again, the first time you meet Rick Perry, for example, I would suggest just shaking his hand. Okay? Otherwise, it'll be misinterpreted, and chimpanzees misinterpret it, and the next thing you know, their hair goes up and they bite you, and it's just not a good thing. All right, so if chimps and bonobos can have a kind of animal politics, maybe humans can as well, and that's really this basic idea is that there are animal differences. And so now that if politics are in the genes of chimps and bonobos are in the genes of humans, and here I'll give you there's a nice little example of politics running genetically in a family. You can see you've got Bush Sr. along with his father, Senator Bush, and then you see Bush with his son, W, and then over here you see our next passing of the torch, you see George and Jeb, who will be the Republican nominee for president and will be elected 2 years from now, and then of course Prescott, who will be elected 8 years from now. So there's the political lineage, and now here's the genuine puzzle for this. Is Prescott Bush, the younger, George P. here, is he political and moving into the political elite because he inherited genetically things from Prescott Sr. down through HW and W? Is that just the genetic transmission of political ability, interest, as well as, notice they're all in the same place in the spectrum, right? They're all to the right. So is this because they're genetically related, or is it just because if you grow up in a family in which your father is active in politics and a Republican, that what you learn then is politics is important and you learn to be on the right? The two things are confounded. Right, so when we study families and we see that politics runs in families, the question is always, does it run in families by learning and socialization and teaching and example, or does it run by genetics? They're confounded.
That's been an ongoing debate in entrepreneurship as well.
Absolutely.
Can you learn an entrepreneur, or can you learn those skills? And
yeah, and a whole host of traits are like this. I focus on politics, but this should be your model for everything about humans. Right? There are people who are more conscientious than other people. There are people who are more entrepreneurial. There are people who are risk averse and people who are risk takers. Is that something that you acquire as a result of upbringing, or is that something you're born predisposed to?
If you have 50 monkeys of either variety, do they know the social order they're in, 1 through 50?
Yes.
Or do they have such a thing?
Absolutely. So among bonobos, there isn't any question of where they are in that social order. They know where it is, and it's based on the ranking of the females. So the females are discretely ranked in a group of 100 bonobos. The 50 females will be ranked 1 to 50. In chimpanzees, the ranking will be mobile depending on who they're associated with among the males, but the 50 males will be ranked 1 down.
So number 33 knows right where he is.
Number 33 knows where he is, and what number 33 will typically do is form up a partnership with number 2 will recruit a bunch of number 5s, and particularly 25, 26s, 27s, people who are no threat to him, and then collectively they'll go around behind the back of number 1, and they'll club him with a big rock and drag him off, and then suddenly number 2 becomes number 1, number 33 becomes number 15, as long as he stays in the right place, or she in the case of bonobos. And so this is just, all I'm doing is explaining politics to you, right? This is the way politics work, right? So now, let's see if we can figure this out. Now here's some science and a bunch of numbers, and so that's always complicated and tough, but I'm going to run you through it real quick. This is a study of twins. This happens to be done in Minnesota, but we've done the same thing in Australia and Denmark. It's been done in Japan. And so maybe I'll just preface this by saying why we're studying twins. We're studying twins not because twins themselves are interesting, but because in humans there are actually 2 completely different kinds of twins. what we refer to as twins, which is multiples, are in fact in humans two very distinct things. Twins that are we would call non-identical twins, or what are technically dizygotic twins, those twins are in fact just multiples, just like a cat often typically gives birth to a litter. Those are just multiples. They're just siblings born at the same time. Aside from the fact that they're born at the same time, they're no different than any other siblings. They're no more genetically related than any other two siblings. They're just siblings born at the same time. So again, very much like a litter of cats or a litter of dogs. Identical twins are something completely different. They arise from a completely different biological process. They are, in terms of their encoding genetics, they are 100% identical. They are clones. If you're ever wondering if cloning works, it works if you start young enough, because identical twins are clones of each other. They share every bit of their genetic material with each other. They are not like any other set of siblings, and they're also not common in the animal world. One of the things that may surprise you to know, there's never been a documented case of identical twinning in cats or dogs. Despite the fact that they almost always give birth to multiples, there is no documented example. The only documented example of routine twinning outside of humans is in armadillos. Don't ask me why, but being from Texas, I love anything that allows me to hike the armadillo. So this very unusual characteristic of humans, that sometimes the twins are in fact clones and sometimes they're just siblings, allows us to compare the two. So when we look at twins, what we're really comparing are same-sex dizygotic twins, non-identical twins, to same-sex identical twins. If something's being driven by genetics, it's going to show up as a stronger correlation in the identical twins than in the non-identical twins. Because if you think about it, if it's being driven by the environment, whether you're an identical twin or a non-identical twin, you still have the same set of parents as your twin. You still were born at the same time as your twin. You were in utero with your twin. The world was 9/11 occurred at the same age as your twin. You went to the same school as your twin, typically often through high school, but certainly through elementary school. So the world, the socializing world you grew up in is the same. It's not true for other siblings, right? Older siblings may have a different life than younger siblings, but non-identical twins are siblings born at the same time. They share the same environment. If the environment's making you alike, it's going to make them alike. If there's no genetics involved, then the identical twins will also be as alike as the non-identical twins. We take advantage of that.
How do you read the chart?
All right, so if you go over to the column labeled heritability,
Okay.
that number on a scale of 1 to 0 tells you what part of the similarity can be accounted for by genetics. The next one over shared environment tells you about socialization, the way you grew up, the things your parents told you, the schools you went to, the time in history you grew up. And what you'll see in this table, if you look down that column of shared environment, you'll see that all those numbers are either very small or negative.
Right.
If you look down heritability, you'll see that those are quite large. Typically up in the 5 to the 0.5 to 0.6 range. What that means is that the final column is sort of your unshared experience. This is your adult experience, the where you went off to college, the friends you made, the job you took, the mentor you found in your corporation, all those kinds of things. And what you see is that if we want to think about where our adult political orientations, the individuals in this study are all age 50 to 70. So we're not talking about children here, we're talking about sort of your full adult life where you are politically. It is a function approximately equally of genetic inheritance and then your unique life experience, the unique life that you have that's different from what your twin had, whether you're identical or non-identical, your free will, the kinds of things that captured your attention. There's virtually no role for socialization. So the tendency of political beliefs to run in families, the tendency of you to be conservative because your parents were conservative is genetic. That part, the connection within the family is genetic. There's virtually no transmission from socialization. The fact that your parents are both conservatives, that they sent you to religious schools, that they enrolled you in the National Legion, essay contest, all that kind of stuff that you think had such a formative shaping effect on you, all of that is having an effect on you, but it's having an effect on you on top of a predisposition that you get genetically. If you're genetically predisposed to be liberal, what happens when your parents are very conservative and they do all that? I had a great friend who said that this couldn't possibly be true because he knew the reason he was conservative was because of the conservative values he got from his hardworking Iowa farm family. the lessons his father taught him, the lessons he learned getting up at 5 in the morning and working hard for a living and understanding that you do this on your own and the government doesn't do it for you and so forth. And he just knew it was that did it. It wasn't the genetics. And he said, for example, my brother is completely useless. He moved to California when he was 17. He was never worth a damn on the farm. He would not get up. He hated it. He argued with my dad. He ran off to California. He's a surfer now. I said, so what are you telling me? I mean, you both lived in the same house. You both were in Iowa. You both did the same work. It never worked for your brother. He said, oh, no, from the time he was a kid, you could tell he was worthless. Well, that's my point. Right? If you're genetically that way, then what you do is you're the classic, the prodigal son. You revolt against this environment. You fight with your parents. You fight with your siblings. You come home at Thanksgiving and start arguments over the Obama presidency and Obamacare. This is because the real transmission, the real predisposition is genetic. And the tendency of politics to run in families is genetic, as it is for a lot of other characteristics. And it's not just ideology. That first column is your sort of direction left-right. That's highly heritable. Also highly heritable is the extremity of attitudes. That is, the tendency to be extreme is very much biologically heritable. Your sense of political efficacy, that is the idea that your actions matter, that public officials care about what you think, the kind of things that make people vote, give money, and run for office, those are heritable. You don't get that from your parents' example of you should vote or you should participate. You get that impulse to participate genetically rather than through socialization. And your level of interest in politics is also something that you inherit biologically.
So then to state the obvious, the Daddy Bush, the Senator Bush, has that genetics down? Is that
absolutely? That is exactly right. So the similarity in politics between generations, right? So you share about half the genetic material with your biological parents. Right. So that's being, again, transmitted only about 50% because you only share about half the genetic material. But that the likely predisposition that's transferred within families is transferred biologically. Which means, for example, if you're one of they did a study in New York where they actually genotyped people children who came into the emergency room and their parents. And what they discovered was in approximately 20% of intact families in which both parents had indicated that they were the biological parents of the offspring, in about 20% of those families, the father was in fact not the father of the child that he thought he was the father of. It turns out the mothers were always right about whether they had had the child or not. If you think about that, that's a pretty hard thing to be mistaken about. You either give birth to a child or you don't. You don't usually get confused about that. But it turns out that the father's involvement depends on a fairly faulty long-term memory. Like, well, about 9 months ago, I think, possible that, So there's a lot of mistaken paternity. So sometimes politics doesn't run in families because, in fact, the family is not as biologically intact as it might believe itself to be. The same insight from twin studies has been reproduced, as I said, elsewhere in the world. It's also been reproduced in adoption studies, which are an entirely different methodology. So if we take adopted children, we compare them to their biological parents, and we compare them to their siblings who they were raised with but who they're not biologically related to. There basically is little or no correlation between adopted children and their adoptive parents in terms of politics, and there's no correlation between adopted siblings and biological children in the same family. There is a correlation though with their parents. A really fascinating study on educational achievement looked at the final educational achievement. So what grade level did you complete? It was done with Korean adoptees. So there were a lot of Korean children adopted in the United States during the Korean War. So they were adopted in the 50s, early 50s, so they're now adults, they've completed education. And the organization that did this was, I believe, a Presbyterian organization, and they kept very careful records, and they also placed children randomly. So Catholic adoption agencies usually try to place children with similar families. If the parents who are giving up the child are educated, they try to find an educated adoptive family. The Presbyterians just did first come, first serve. Whoever was next on the list got the next infant. Perfect for scientific study. It turned out that 75% of the final educational achievement of the Korean infants who were raised in the United States had no contact with their biological parents can be explained by knowing the education level of their biological parents in Korea. And only about 20% can be explained by knowing the education level of their adoptive parents who raised them from infancy and who provided all the things, provided the money for them to go to college, the incentive, the model, the books in the house, the classical music, all that kind of stuff. It makes a difference, but not as big a difference as we think. So biology makes a big difference. If you're predisposed to be political, or you're predisposed to be liberal, or predisposed to be an alcoholic, it's going to play a big role. It is not destiny. You can, if you're predisposed to be an alcoholic, you can not drink, but it's a lot easier to not drink if you're predisposed to be a non-drinker. So if you think,
does that suggest that two children by the same parents, one could have the predominant characteristics of the dad, and one could have the predominant characteristics of the mom?
yes. So you can, this is one of the topics this brings up, of course, is the mixed marriage. Often a mistake to have a mixed marriage, you know, where a liberal marries a conservative. This happens sometimes. It most often happens because young conservative men, being upstanding and the wonderful fellows that they are, think that sort of maybe during their college years they're entitled to one fling with a redhead liberal woman, and that is an evening you won't forget. And but sometimes that woman becomes pregnant because, you know, young conservative males are quite virile. And when she becomes pregnant, you know, a liberal male would know exactly what to do. You know, if he's a really good guy, offer to pay for the abortion, otherwise just steer clear. But a good conservative male marries that woman and raises a family with her and stands by her the rest of her life, even though there are political discussions that are quite uncomfortable throughout that marriage. And then the children are, of course, this is where moderates come from. If you wonder where independents come from, people who just can't make up their mind about politics, mostly from mixed marriages. It's really, it's not their fault. They just, you know, this is just one of the things. So this is like, avoid this at all costs. You don't, the mixed marriage is always a...
The implications for this are huge. I've never heard anything about this. Have y'all ever heard anything about this?
Well, let me show you something really quick about religion. It turns out that everything I've told you about politics is true of religion as well. And in fact, if you think about it historically, religion is the original politics. The way we did large-scale social living for the first 10,000 years was religion. Right? All the original leadership was religious. All the original monarchs were divine right monarchs, whatever the religious category, doesn't matter. It was like you rule by divine right, you rule through religion. The priests were the government. It's only by the time you break into the Greek and Roman era that you start to get this separation, right? That render unto Caesar is an amazing and weird thing. Like Caesar gets stuff, and Caesar is not. You know, even Caesar dabbles with the idea that maybe it would be better to be a god or at least a demigod. Right? So this same kind of thing we see in religion, and here's a twin study example I think is very instructive. So here we're asking people two different questions. The first question we ask is, how often do you attend religious services? And if you look at the heritability there, there is a slight heritability, but the shared environment is more important than the heritability. So the likelihood that if you attend religious services and your parents attended religious services, the main reason that both of you are religiously observant is because your parents taught you that. They took you to church from the time you were small. They took you there every week or more than once a week if you grew up Baptist in the South like I did. So this was modeled for you. When we think about transmission through socialization, it works for religious attendance. That's how you build a churchgoer. You take those kids to church. One of the reasons why this doesn't work for voting is that we don't actually vote every Sunday. We vote once every 2 years, and we don't take our kids to voting. We don't let them vote until they're 18. By then it's too late. Can you imagine a world in which you weren't allowed to take your kids to church until they were 18, and you only went to church once every 2 years? It's not going to work. So, on the other hand, if you ask people how much they consider religion to be an important part of their life, this is religiosity, their internal sense of transcendence. That's almost entirely genetically transmitted or unshared environment. So you can't make your kids inherently religious by your example, by the training, all the rest. You can make them observant, but you can't make them transcendent. Transcendence is something you give to them biologically. That's something we inherit. We either have that sense or we don't have that sense. We can be observant either way. But for some people, that observance comes from the inside, and from other people, it comes from the front of the brain or sort of the thought process. All right, now, very quickly, how is this possible? Because it sounds astonishing, and particularly if you know much about genetics, it's really weird. How could you have a gene that codes for, you know, your opinion on abortion? It just doesn't make any sense. And so, this is what I'm going to tell you. It isn't about being predisposed to the particular issues of the day. It's about being predisposed in some very basic way in terms of how your brain is built. All right? So, I'm going to focus on two quick examples. One is the amygdala, which is a part of your brain that is responsible for fear and anxiety. And the other part is the insula, which is responsible for disgust. We've also done work on the anterior cingulate, which is responsible for flip-flopping. Turns out we can explain why liberals are flip-floppers. It has to do with their interior cingulate. Or conservatives are not flip-floppers because they've got a different interior cingulate. And then there's also some work on sense of smell. Liberals and conservatives have a somewhat different sense of smell, right? So liberals are the red bars, and conservatives who want strong protective policies are the blue bars. And what you're seeing is when they see the snake, right, you can see what happens there, right? When they see the snake, and this is measured, again, at 13,000th of a second by skin response, not by a mental response. Conservatives are immediately alarmed by the snake, and liberals are, in fact, actually show slightly less activity than they did before they saw the snake. On the other side, we're showing the rabbit. When conservatives see the rabbit, they are calmed by the rabbit rather than alarmed by the rabbit. When liberals see the rabbit, they are calmed by the rabbit, but not quite as much as they were calmed by the snake. Okay, there is, if you look at those two red bars, there is no physiological difference for a liberal, on a defense policy liberal. This is right. So somebody who says, let's all just be friends, like if we just had dinner with the North Koreans, this could all possibly be worked out, right? How could you sit down to dinner with the North Koreans? Well, if you could sit down to dinner with a snake, you could sit down to dinner with the North Koreans, right? There is a mental process by which liberals determine threat, but there is not a physiological process by which they're alerted to threat in their gut. Okay, hawks, real conservatives, and this I mean real conservatives. I don't mean like Mitt Romney. I mean real conservatives feel threat in their gut and immediately. And other conservatives can detect if you don't feel that threat, even if you are in your brain a conservative. If you're not in your gut conservative, other conservatives will say, "I don't think you get it. I don't think you were as scared of the North Koreans as quickly as I was scared of the North Koreans." All right, now this is using a completely different metric. Here we're using blink response. We're not using pictures of threatening things. We're putting headphones on you and we play a burst of white noise. When I play a burst of white noise in headphones, you blink. It's a normal human reaction to blink. But up on the top, that's the blink response of conservatives. On the bottom is the blink response of liberals. Liberals from the very beginning don't blink as hard, and by the time you've done this 5 times, liberals stop blinking altogether. Conservatives, so far as we can tell, conservatives never stop blinking. We did this with one person for an hour. We did this over 70 times. They never stopped blinking in response to the loud noise. Okay, that response, that reflex response to blink in threat, is very powerful in people who are defense hawks, and it is virtually non-existent in people who are liberal. So again, if you think about this in terms of how you evolve an opinion about whether North Korea is dangerous or whether an open border is dangerous, if you're a person who doesn't experience threat of any kind in a physiological way, it takes a real argument to make you come around to the idea that we need to do something here. If you experience threat immediately, viscerally, in 13,000th of a second, you're predisposed to want to favor a protective policy. Again, you can end up on any side of the spectrum intellectually. That's what that 50% that's unexplained is. But where you start, the starting point for a hawk is a gut reaction of alertness to threat. So if you want to hire a bodyguard, for example, you should ask them 3 questions. Ask them their opinion on Obamacare. Ask them how they feel about abortion. Like, ask them a basic conservative battery. If they look like a good conservative, they're going to be a great bodyguard. Okay? If they're a liberal, they're not going to be a good bodyguard. Okay? They'll be a good tour guide, but they're not, because they'll take you to North Korea or Cuba or whatever, but they won't be a good bodyguard. You want a bodyguard who sees threat and responds to it viscerally. In my view, I want a Secretary of Defense who sees this and responds to it, right?
Do you know if the Secret Service uses or any defense people use this mechanism?
One of the things that happens is we get steered into professions based on this kind of thing, right? If you are naturally responsive to it, you're naturally alert to it, if it's a natural part of what you do, and that impulse to do something about it. So if you put this together with being extroverted and entrepreneurial, you've got somebody who's going to go into a business like the Secret Service or the FBI. If you don't really see the threat and you're not particularly, outgoing, you're probably going to be a computer programmer at Rice, and that'll be okay. The world will balance itself out. And this is a study that confirms this and actually measures something completely different. It just measures the physical size of your amygdala in your brain. And this is a study that was actually, if you look at the names on the study there, you'll see the 3rd name on that study is Colin Firth. That is the Colin Firth, the actor. The amazingly handsome, incredibly charming Colin Firth is actually an author on this paper and is the one who funded the study, because he couldn't believe that the differences in Parliament, that these crazy arguments in Parliament were between people who could biologically the same thing. He believed that the liberals and the Tories and so forth just had to have completely different brains or they couldn't be so crazy. So he actually commissioned a study in which they measured the volume of the brains, and it turned out he's absolutely right. Conservatives have bigger amygdalas, hence they're more responsive to threat. Right? So we can actually measure that as a physical level, and this is just showing you that basic same. Now, I keep this to the end because I know you're eating and I'm not. The other picture is worse. It's a picture of a public restroom, so you're lucky for this. This is a disgusting image. It's an image of a person eating live night crawlers. The person who's eating the live night crawlers is my co-author on these studies, Professor John Hibbing from the University of Nebraska. The picture we use in the studies is actually a picture of another person eating night crawlers, but the image is protected. It's a copyrighted image owned by the American Psychological Association, and they won't allow it to be used in presentations or in publications because they want people to not be, accustomed to the image. So we had to create our own. We started thinking about how we would do that. I suggested Photoshop, and being a Nebraska farm boy, he suggested just going and getting some night crawlers at the bait shop and putting them in his mouth, and we'd take pictures, which he did. I got to confess that it's somewhat revealing, but I mean I couldn't do that. So now this is a scaling of disgust. So we're looking at measuring disgust by skin response and by self-reported disgust. And I'm showing you this just so you can see there really is a difference. People's self-reported disgust is not the same as their physiological response to disgust. And one of the ways you can see that is when we look at males and females. Females report being about twice as easily disgusted as males. In fact, when we record the physiology, females are in fact not in any sense different in their physiological response to disgust. So here's a good example of the fact that social norms and enculturation really do matter. Females report being more disgusted and males report being less disgusted, not because females are in fact physiologically more easily disgusted, but just because there is a cultural... Sorry, I showed this once at a...
It's good theater.
Yeah, I showed this once at an audience, and there was a nurse, an attending nurse who was there. And I said, this is, females are sort of, reporting to be more easily disgusted shows sensitivity or something. And afterwards she said, no, males are underreporting disgust responsiveness. Males don't like to admit that they're easily disgusted. And she said, I'll give you a perfect example. If I'm getting ready to draw blood and the husband is there, and I say, now, does this side of blood bother you? And she said, if it's the sister, she'll say, yeah, it bothers me, I'll leave the room. If it's the husband or the brother, they say, no, it doesn't faze me, go ahead. And she said, 3 seconds later, bam, on the floor, passed out. Okay, the males will not admit to the fact that if they see blood, they will fall on the floor fainted because it doesn't sound manly, and so they instead will risk life, collapse on the floor before they would admit that they are in fact so disgusted by blood that they can't look at it. Now, what has this got to do with politics? We measure this and we connect it back to political opinions. It turns out it has absolutely nothing to do with defense policy. How easily disgusted you are has no effect on your position about border security. It has no effect on your opinion about national defense policy. That's how easily you're threatened. That doesn't have anything to do with how easily you're disgusted. What political beliefs can we predict with how easily you're disgusted? Anybody want to guess?
Well, if I understood the question correctly, conservatives are going to be...
Conservatives are, in fact, more easily disgusted, but not defense conservatives. Only conservatives, and not big government conservatives. It's not about libertarianism. It's not about whether you like big government or not. It's not about tax policy. It's conservatives on a particular, narrow set of issues, and what are they?
Abortion, gay marriage.
Abortion, gay marriage, premarital sex, divorce. Okay? The issues that are directly related to sex, people who are easily disgusted are aversive to. They push back on that. One of my favorite examples is don't ask, don't tell. And I relate this back again to my father, who was very conservative and career military, and he sort of, toward the end of his life, came around to the idea that gays were gays and whatever, but he said, I just don't want to see it, okay? I don't, if you want to be gay, do whatever you want to do, live your life, but don't go parading down my street, because I don't like to see men kissing men. It makes me sick. Okay, if you're easily disgusted, that's exactly what we see. You can see here's gay marriage, support or oppose, and you can see what we see here. The opposition to gay marriage is people who are very responsive to disgust images. That next table over where it says non-disgustive aversive images, that's actually the threat image. So your physical response to a threat image has nothing to do with whether you support or oppose gay marriage, but it is highly predictive of whether you the disgust images are highly predictive of how you feel about gay marriage. In fact, we can actually stimulate this if we leave a trash can full of nasty, rotting food in a room, and we have somebody fill out a questionnaire. Everybody who fills out the questionnaire, whether they're initially liberal or conservative or moderate, will give more conservative answers on abortion, divorce, gay marriage, on sexual issues. That prompting disgust, just making the environment disgusting, will make them more aversive. If you take somebody who gives conservative opinions and you put them in a very well-ordered, clean, sterile environment, they will give less conservative answers to this. So they're more tolerant of gay marriage if they're in a nice, clean room than if they're in a room that smells bad. So now, and then here we come to we're back to the issue of marriage, right? So this is the politics. This also affects mate choice as well. So here's a famous couple. They're famous. Whenever I tell people that conservatives and liberals don't ever actually breed with each other, people always point out James Carville, the raging Cajun from Carville, Louisiana, and Mary Maitland, because Mary Maitland worked in the Bush administration, conservative commentator, very, very good, solid, absolutely biological conservative. James Carville is an absolutely insane and purely biological liberal, no question about it. They share in common an enormous interest, intense interest in politics, but not much else when it comes to being political. They are married to each other. Reasonably successful marriage, although if you've ever seen clips off TV shows they've done together, there are times in which you wonder that they stay married after just one political discussion because they really, really, years of marriage. One of the old myths was that if you married somebody who's different politically than you, in 50 years of marriage you'd kind of come around to a middle ground. There's absolutely no evidence of that at all. People who are married 50 years are as different politically at 50 years as they were the day they were married, or even in the few studies where we can go back to when they were dating, as different as they were when they were dating. You don't acclimate yourself to another person in a marriage. People who are politically oriented stay that way, they stay separate, and that's where the sort of mixed marriages. Fortunately, there aren't a lot of mixed marriages, and this is the correlation between people who are actually married and have had children. So these are what in biology we would consider to be breeding pairs. Right? So not just people who are married, but people who are married and have actually had children. The correlation on that bottom characteristic, extroversion, there is essentially no correlation at all. So if you think about what people talk about when they're talking about looking for a mate, well, I'm outgoing, so I'm looking for somebody who's sort of outgoing like me. It turns out there is no personality trait for which there is any positive correlation between mate pairs. So we don't really choose long-term mates on the basis of personality. The Stunkard silhouette is your actual body outline. You can be really skinny or medium or big like me or whatever. And you think that has a lot to do with the sort of who gets attracted to who, and so it's very little, virtually no correlation. That is small and not significant. Body weight, BMI, all that kind of stuff, very small correlation. Frequency of smoking, which for me would be just an absolute deal breaker. Back when I smoked, I had nothing to do with women unless they smoked. I quit smoking within 2 weeks. I have nothing to do with women unless they don't smoke. So I'm just an invariant on this kind of thing. I'm just a jerk about smoking. So that turned out that's surprisingly weak correlation. Education is a higher correlation than what I would have thought, about 0.5. So there's a lot of assortation by education. And this is not about who you meet or who you run into. We can control for all of those kinds of things, and we still find assortation on education. Drinking frequency is right up there close to ideology. Being a teetotaler and being married to someone who is a serious drinker is just, it either doesn't happen in the sense of you actually forming a long-term pair bond, or it doesn't, you don't end up actually having children. So there's a very strong assortation on drinking. Drinkers tend to be married to drinkers, and those marriages tend to last and produce children. Non-drinkers to non-drinkers. And again, there's almost no accommodation. Drinkers they don't kind of meet in the middle somewhere. You marry an alcoholic and you both end up social drinkers. Doesn't happen. And then at the top of the list, the strongest correlation, this is actually a study that measured about 80 different characteristics across married pairs. And the single strongest correlation across married pairs that produce children is their ideology. So the real, if you're meeting someone for the first time and wondering if this could be a long-term relationship, ask them about Obama. Ask them what they think about President Obama. Actually, when I taught this in class, I had a student who said, this is so true. She said, I met this guy at the pub, And we like hit it right off. It was like they were doing a sports night thing and they were showing lacrosse or something. We both liked lacrosse and we started talking about that. Turned out we were both from Florida. You know, we had similar backgrounds. We liked the same things. We both traveled to Europe and backpacked, and she said we were like for 3 weeks, we were just like inseparable. We were having a great time. Then we were back in the pub and a presidential speech came on. And she said, and this guy said, "Can you believe that asshole is the president of the United States?" And she said, I said, "I'm sorry, are you talking about the president of the United States?" And he said, yeah, Obama, that idiot, is our president. And she said, I could have killed this person. So she said, you know, he realized that, you know, it was a faux pas. He said, you know, I just assumed, you know, we were alike on everything. I mean, I thought you were conservative. She said, I never said anything conservative. She said, I thought you were a liberal. You're a nice guy. You've been really nice to me. And well, I just assumed you were a liberal. It's one of the mistakes liberals often make about conservatives about liberals. These really are, but all the other characteristics are just blended through the population. Conservatives can be nice, and they can be, and liberals can actually be honest. There are all kinds of misconceptions about how all that works. So, and she said, we talked that over, and then we tried very hard for 2 weeks to get back to where we were, and we finally just had to write it off. She said, I just could not. She said, there was something about it that just seemed creepy to me, and he couldn't quite. And so this is it, right? This is a deal killer. We are, whether we're easily disgusted or not, people at the ends of the political spectrum are actually physically disgusted by people on the other end. Now, it's a great, I had a conversation about this with Rush Limbaugh, who's a very, very interesting fellow. And he said, I'll give you an example of this. He said, I stopped supporting John McCain when he shook hands with Ted Kennedy. Okay, they had done a bill together, and they had worked together and come to some middle ground that was good for everybody. And at the end of that process, they shook hands on the Senate floor. And he said, I could probably work with Ted Kennedy on something, but I could not shake his hand. Okay, and he meant that just like in a sense that like, I would not want to touch his hand. Right? He's Ted Kennedy, but I wouldn't want to touch his hand. Right? And that's that physical aversion, that sense that you would have to like go wash your hands after you shook hands with someone on the opposite side. That's real gut liberals and real gut conservatives are physically, are at a gut level, are repelled by the opposite political party. So if you wonder where political polarization comes from, it's as old as human beings. It will never go away. Sometimes it's moderated, sometimes it's advanced. It's advanced when we stack the parties up alongside this. Like the real gut thing is not the parties. The real gut thing is being conservative or liberal. So when you took the most conservative 20% of America, all of which were Southern Democrats, and moved them into the Republican Party, things changed. Right? Republicans were no longer as big a tent as they used to be because they now had some real conservatives in the party. And liberals were no longer as big a tent as they were partly because they didn't need as big a tent because there weren't as many of them as there used to be, and partly because they didn't have, right, once you take people like Lyndon Johnson out of the Democratic Party and put them into the Republican Party, the Democratic Party is simply not the broad spectrum party. And now the real battle, which is left versus right, starts getting fought out as not just left versus right, but Democrat versus Republican, right? So we've now put on jerseys on the conservatives and the liberals, and now there's a real political battle. But this is a political battle that has been going on since the beginning of history, and it's built into the genes of people, and it determines not only their politics, but basically everything else about their life. It determines where they live. Liberals live in cities. Liberals live in inner cities. Where is that true? It turns out it's true everywhere in the world. It turns out it's true throughout history. In every city that we can find anywhere in history, the politics at the center of that large city is more liberal than the politics out in the exurbs. So this idea that the development of the suburbs and Republicans moving to the suburbs, that's as old as history. There was no center city. Like downtown Salt Lake City is the most liberal place in Utah. Okay, not liberal compared to downtown Berkeley or something, but way more liberal than the rest, and that's true everywhere, right? So it determines where we live. If we're not suited to that, we move out. So there's a constant sorting. People are constantly moving out to places or into places. Liberals go to New York on a trip and say, "This is lovely. I love it. I want to live here." Right? People who are born in New York and go to Des Moines say, "That's it, man. I'm moving to Des Moines. I love that place. That's my kind of life." Right? So Basically what I want this to do is the takeaway from this is really fairly simple. This is something a critic published about our work, which is, he said that this claim is astonishing because if it was true, it would require nothing less than a revision of understanding of all of human history, much if not most of political science, sociology, anthropology, psychology, as well as perhaps our understanding of what it means to be human. So, much to his chagrin, I've used this quote ever since. It is my favorite thing anybody has ever said about me. He hates us and he hates our work and he hates the implication of it, but I think he's absolutely right. And the bottom line is the takeaway. All I want you to take away from this is I want this to just change your fundamental understanding of what it means to be a human being. Okay? A human being, at root, a human being is a mammal. Okay? Our behavior is distinctive because we're mammals, not because we're humans. And the difference in our behavior, the way we behave differently, just as is true, think about domesticated dogs, right? Do you think the behavior of golden shepherds is similar, or golden labs is similar to the behavior of pit bulls or Rottweilers? Now, all Rottweilers are not mean. All golden retrievers are not sweet, but by golly, if there are two doors and there's a retriever behind one door and a pit bull behind the other, go to the door with the retriever, okay? They have different personalities. They are not genetically different, right? All domesticated dogs are genetically identical to gray wolves, right? They are just simply wolves that have been pulled apart by selective breeding, okay? And so that's, right, humans are all mammals. We share a whole lot of traits in common, but we also have some traits in which we differ behaviorally by our biology. And so that's the way, if you think about humans as being kind of just like the great world of dogs or the great world of cats, but some of us are born pit bulls and some of us are born golden retrievers, and golden retrievers are liberals. It's just a fact, right? They're pathetically in need of assurance, and they're constantly trying to please people, and they're not very conscientious, and right, so they're like golden retriever puppies. This is something else Limbaugh said. He said, this explains to me liberals. He always thought liberals were basically like puppy dogs. They're enthusiastic and they pee all over the place, and then they say, well, I can't help it, I'm just a puppy. Right? So that's his view. That was his view, and I said, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from. I know you don't really like liberals a lot. He said, no, I don't know. Although he claimed he didn't hate them. I asked him about that. He was really upset about it. He said, well, this explains why liberals hated George W. Bush. And he said, I don't understand that. You should never hate somebody. That's just not the way humans are built. You shouldn't hate people. And I said, well, I hate to bring this up, but I've heard you a couple of times speak about Hillary Clinton, and it strikes me that you are not, in fact, a particular fan of Hillary Clinton's. He said, oh, absolutely. He said, but you offend me if you say I hate Hillary Clinton. I do not hate Hillary Clinton. I am disgusted by her. I loathe Hillary Clinton. I loathe everything she stands for, everything she does. I wouldn't want to be in the same room with her, but I certainly don't hate her. And I thought, wow, I think I would rather be hated. But apparently he really rise to the level of being hateable, just loathable, which was somehow much friendlier or something. I don't know. But anyway, I thought he was possibly correct. And then finally, because in the end everything is about commerce, there's actually a book about this. I'm actually one of the authors and therefore a recipient of royalties. And so if you want to go on Amazon, buy a book to read more about this, or buy a book just to tick off friends of yours or family members who have strong political beliefs, and you want to offer an explanation for it, then that's the book, Predisposed. It's a light, lively read. It's not political science. It's popular science. So I can recommend it without reservation or hesitation, because every time you buy it, I get paid, and that's a good thing. So, thank you very much.